My name is Olivia Harper. I'm 38 years old, and for nearly a decade, my husband and I have lived in a quiet suburban neighbourhood just outside the city. It's the kind of place real estate agents love to describe. Tree-lined streets, well-kept front lawns, children riding bicycles until sunset, neighbours walking their dogs after dinner. From the outside, it looked like the perfect place to grow old. Most days, it really was. Until you reached one particular house. The house belonged to Richard Collins. If you asked Richard, he'd probably tell you everyone on the street complained too much, that people should mind their own business. The rest of us saw something very different. Richard had a habit of treating public spaces as if they belonged to him. Like many people during the COVID lockdowns, my husband and I started taking long evening walks. At first, it was simply an excuse to leave the house. A little fresh air, a little exercise. A chance to escape staring at the same four walls every day. Even after life returned to normal, we never stopped. Almost every evening around sunset, we'd head out for a 40-minute walk together. It became our favourite part of the day. Our route changed often, but there was one stretch of sidewalk we almost always used. Not because it was beautiful, because it was practical. It was the only sidewalk connecting two of the busiest streets in our neighbourhood. Without it, you'd have to walk directly in the road with passing traffic. Naturally, parents pushing strollers used it, children riding scooters used it, older residents with walkers used it. Anyone using a wheelchair depended on it. It wasn't just another sidewalk, it was the safest path through the neighbourhood. Unfortunately, it also ran directly in front of Richard's driveway. At first, I assumed the blocked sidewalk was an accident. One pickup truck parked across the concrete. No big deal, it happens. The next evening, it happened again. Then another SUV appeared. A few days later, 4 different vehicles somehow managed to completely block every inch of the sidewalk. Not once, not twice, every single evening, almost like clockwork. One afternoon, a young mother pushing a stroller reached Richard's driveway. She stopped, looked left, looked right, then carefully pushed her baby into the street while cars continued driving past. A week later, an elderly man using a walker approached the same spot. He stared at the blocked sidewalk for several seconds, then quietly turned around and walked the long way home instead. My husband watched him disappear around the corner. Softly, he said, "Someone's going to get hurt one day." I couldn't disagree, because every evening I watched the exact same thing happen, again and again and again. Eventually, I decided to speak to Richard directly, not to argue, just to ask. One evening, he was washing his truck while all 4 family vehicles sat across the sidewalk. I smiled politely. "Hey, Richard, would you mind leaving the sidewalk clear?" He barely looked up. "It's my driveway. I'll park however I want." I pointed toward the sidewalk. "I know, but the sidewalk isn't part of your driveway. People with wheelchairs and strollers can't get through." For the first time, he looked directly at me, then laughed. "They've got a street. They can use that." His wife laughed too. Neither of them sounded embarrassed. If anything, they looked entertained, as though making other people's lives more difficult was somehow funny. Over the next month, several neighbours contacted code enforcement. Nothing happened. Someone contacted the HOA. Nothing happened. A few parents complained during neighbourhood meetings. Still, nothing changed. Every evening, the sidewalk disappeared beneath Richard's vehicles, and every evening, families stepped into traffic because one man believed his convenience mattered more than everyone else's safety. The more he realised nobody was stopping him, the more confident he became. One evening, as my husband and I walked around his driveway yet again, something caught my attention. Richard's mailbox. Its bright red flag was standing straight up, probably waiting for the mail carrier the next morning. I stared at it for a moment. then looked back at the 4 vehicles blocking the public sidewalk. A small thought crossed my mind. It wouldn't damage anything. It wasn't dangerous. It wouldn't cost Richard a single dollar. It was nothing more than a tiny inconvenience. I reached out, gently lowered the little red mailbox flag, then continued walking as though nothing had happened. At the time, I thought it was the pettiest revenge imaginable. I had absolutely no idea that tiny red flag would become the first domino in a chain of events that would eventually bring the entire neighbourhood to Richard's front door. At first, lowering Richard's mailbox flag made me laugh. It was childish, petty, completely harmless, and honestly, it made me feel a little better. The next evening, as my husband and I walked past his house again, the flag was up. I quietly reached over, lowered it, and kept walking. No one noticed, or at least, I didn't think they did. A few days later, my husband looked over at me with a grin. "You know, I think you're enjoying that a little too much," I smiled. "Maybe. It's either that or start yelling every time I see those cars," he laughed. "I'll take the mailbox." So every evening, our routine became strangely predictable. We'd walk, Richard's vehicles would be blocking the sidewalk, we'd step into the street, I'd lower the little red mailbox flag, then we'd continue our walk. It took less than 2 seconds, yet somehow, those 2 seconds became the most satisfying part of the entire route. What surprised me most was how many other people had noticed Richard's behaviour. One evening, a father pushing twin strollers caught up with us after we'd crossed the street. He looked back toward Richard's driveway. "That guy again?" I nodded. "He never moves them." The man sighed. "My wife refuses to walk this route anymore. She's afraid one of the kids will roll into traffic." A few minutes later, an older woman walking her golden retriever joined the conversation. "I filed a complaint with the city 3 months ago. They never even responded." Then George, one of our long-time neighbours, shook his head. "Richard knows nobody enforces it. That's why he keeps doing it." That sentence stayed with me, because George wasn't talking about parking, he was talking about attitude. Richard believed rules only mattered if someone forced him to follow them. The following weekend, our neighbourhood held its annual community barbecue at the local park. Families brought homemade food. Children played soccer. People chatted under picnic shelters. It was one of the few times everyone slowed down long enough to actually talk. Somehow, the conversation drifted toward neighbourhood problems. Broken streetlights, speeding cars, missed trash collection. Then someone mentioned Richard. Immediately, everyone had a story. He blocks the sidewalk every night. He leaves his trailer halfway into the street. His guests park wherever they want. My grandson almost got hit by a car because of that driveway. It wasn't just me. It wasn't even just our street. Nearly everyone knew exactly who Richard was. Later that afternoon, Richard himself showed up. He wasn't invited by anyone in particular. He simply walked over, carrying a plate of food, as if nothing had ever happened. The conversations changed immediately. People smiled politely, stopped talking, waited for him to leave. That told me everything. Nobody respected him. They simply didn't want the confrontation. Richard mistook their silence for approval. The next Monday, my husband and I took our usual evening walk. 4 vehicles, same driveway, same blocked sidewalk, same forced detour into traffic. As I reached the mailbox, I lowered the red flag again. This time, I heard something behind me. A curtain moved inside Richard's living room, just slightly, almost too quickly to notice. I kept walking, said nothing. But I had this strange feeling someone had just watched me. The following evening, the mailbox flag wasn't raised. For the first time all week, I smiled to myself. Maybe he finally noticed. My husband chuckled. I guess your little protest is working." I doubt it. Richard wasn't the kind of man who admitted someone had gotten under his skin. If he had noticed, he'd pretend he hadn't. That was exactly the kind of person he was. 3 nights later, the flag was back up, higher than usual, almost perfectly straight, as though someone wanted to make absolutely sure it couldn't be missed. I slowed down, looked at it, then reached out and gently lowered it once again. The moment my fingers left the flag, a voice shouted from across the yard, "Hey!" I turned around. Richard was standing in his garage, arms crossed, staring directly at me. For several seconds, neither of us said a word. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile someone gives when they think they've finally caught you doing something wrong. At that moment, I realized this had stopped being about a blocked sidewalk. Richard wanted a fight. He just hadn't realized he was about to pick the wrong one. Richard slowly walked down his driveway. Not quickly, not angrily, almost confidently, like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. My husband stopped beside me. Richard looked directly at me. "So, you've been messing with my mailbox." His tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory. I glanced at the lowered red flag. I lowered the flag. "I didn't damage anything." His smile disappeared. "You've been trespassing." I blinked. "Trespassing? You reached onto my property." I looked at the mailbox. It sat only inches from the public sidewalk. "I never stepped onto your lawn." "You touched my mailbox," he replied. "That's enough." My husband spoke before I could. "Richard, you block the sidewalk every single day. We've asked politely." "So have other neighbours." Richard shrugged. "So? It's my house, my driveway, my vehicles. If people don't like it, they can walk somewhere else." There it was again, that attitude. As though an entire public sidewalk existed purely for his convenience. The argument lasted less than 2 minutes. Neither side changed their mind. Eventually, Richard stepped back toward his garage, but before walking inside, he pointed directly at me. "You better keep your hands off my mailbox." His voice was calm, almost cheerful. "I've got cameras now." Then he smiled. "I'll be watching." As we continued our walk, my husband looked over at me. "I think he actually installed cameras." "I think so too." "You going to stop?" I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. "No." The mailbox had never been the point. The mailbox simply reminded Richard that other people existed, something he seemed to forget every evening when he blocked the sidewalk. The following night, we returned. Sure enough, a small security camera had appeared above Richard's garage. It pointed directly toward the sidewalk, toward the mailbox, toward anyone walking past. Richard wanted proof. Fine. I wasn't doing anything illegal. As we reached the mailbox, I looked directly into the camera, smiled politely, then gently lowered the red flag. It clicked softly into place. I waved at the camera, then kept walking. My husband burst into laughter. "I can't believe you waved." I figured if he's collecting footage, I should at least be polite. Over the next several days, nothing changed. Every evening, the sidewalk remained blocked. Every evening, I lowered the mailbox flag. Every evening, Richard's camera recorded everything. At first, I assumed he was trying to intimidate me. Then something changed. Richard stopped coming outside. Instead, he watched from inside his living room. The blinds would move ever so slightly as we walked past. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of him standing there, arms folded, watching, waiting, almost hoping I'd do something he could use against me. Unfortunately for him, all I ever did was lower a little red piece of metal. Then, one Saturday morning, A white SUV pulled into Richard's driveway. Not a police car, not code enforcement, a private security company. 2 technicians stepped out carrying ladders. By lunchtime, Richard had installed 3 more cameras. 1 above the garage, 1 beside the front door, 1 mounted on the corner of the house overlooking the street. My husband looked at the setup and laughed. I think you've officially become his hobby. I don't think it's me. What do you mean? I think he's trying to prove he's the victim. That afternoon, I was working from home when George knocked on my door. You got a minute? Of course. He held up his phone. You need to see this. Richard had posted several clips from his security cameras in the neighbourhood Facebook group. The caption read, "Local woman repeatedly vandalising my mailbox. Please identify." I stared at the screen. Vandalising? The video clearly showed me walking past, lowering the flag, then continuing down the sidewalk. That was it. No damage, no force, nothing broken, just a mailbox flag. The comments, however, didn't go the way Richard expected. One person asked, "Why is your truck blocking the sidewalk?" Another commented, "Shouldn't pedestrians be able to use the sidewalk?" Then another, "Forget the mailbox. Why are all 4 of your vehicles parked across public access?" I smiled. Richard had uploaded hours of footage, trying to embarrass me. Instead, he'd accidentally given the entire neighbourhood a front row seat to what everyone had been complaining about for years. And for the first time, people weren't just talking about it. They had video. Clear, undeniable, public video. Richard thought the cameras were protecting him. He had no idea they were quietly building the strongest case anyone had ever seen against him. By Monday morning, the neighbourhood Facebook post had exploded. Hundreds of comments, dozens of shares. Richard had expected people to be angry with me. Instead, almost everyone was asking the same question. Why is the sidewalk blocked every single day? The conversation had completely shifted. Nobody cared about the mailbox anymore. They cared about the families who couldn't use the sidewalk. Richard didn't take that very well. Rather than deleting the post, he doubled down. He replied to almost every comment. It's my property. People should mind their own business. Nobody has the right to touch my mailbox. One neighbour politely replied, "No one wants your mailbox. We just want the sidewalk." Richard ignored that completely. Instead, he uploaded more security clips, different days, different angles, trying to prove I'd been lowering the mailbox flag for weeks. He thought he was building a harassment case. What he didn't realise was that every single video started the same way. 4 vehicles completely blocking the public sidewalk. Every single day. The videos spread beyond our neighbourhood. Someone posted them in a local community group. Then another resident shared them with a pedestrian safety page. By Wednesday, people I'd never met were commenting. One woman wrote, "My husband uses a wheelchair. This isn't an inconvenience. It's discrimination." Another commented, "I push twins in a stroller. I'd report this every single day." Richard kept arguing with strangers online. Each reply made him look more unreasonable. Each video reached more people. And every new viewer noticed exactly the same thing. Not the mailbox, the sidewalk. Late Thursday afternoon, I received a phone call from someone introducing herself as Inspector Karen Lewis from the city's Public Works Department. Her voice was calm. "Mrs. Harper?" "Yes." "I'm calling regarding several complaints we've received about sidewalk obstruction on Maple Ridge Drive." I paused. "This is about Richard Collins, isn't it?" "I'm not able to discuss another resident," she replied professionally. "But I'd like to ask you a few questions about what you've personally observed." For nearly 20 minutes, she asked detailed questions. How often were the vehicles there? What times? Were they completely blocking pedestrian access? Did children use that sidewalk? Were there alternative routes? I answered every question honestly. Nothing more, nothing less. Before ending the call, she said something that caught my attention. We'll be conducting a site inspection. Not reviewing, not considering, inspecting. The following evening, my husband and I took our usual walk. Nothing had changed. Richard's pickup, his son's SUV, his wife's crossover, an older sedan, all parked exactly where they always were. Richard saw us coming. He stepped onto his porch, smiled confidently, then pointed toward one of his cameras. "Lose anything lately?" he called out. I smiled politely. "No, but I think someone else might." He frowned. "What does that mean?" I simply continued walking. Sometimes, the best answer is no answer at all. The next morning, just after 9 o'clock, a white city pickup truck slowly pulled onto Maple Ridge Drive. The city logo was printed on both doors. Inspector Karen Lewis stepped out carrying a clipboard and measuring wheel. She didn't walk straight to Richard's driveway. Instead, she started at the beginning of the sidewalk, measuring, photographing, taking notes. Every few feet, she stopped again, measured again, photographed again. Richard noticed almost immediately. He walked outside with the confidence of someone convinced he was finally about to be proven right. "I'm glad you're here," he said loudly. "I've got videos of my neighbour harassing me." Inspector Lewis smiled politely. "I'd be happy to review those." Richard grinned. "I'll show you everything." He had no idea. He was about to hand over the strongest evidence anyone could possibly collect. Evidence that he had spent weeks recording himself. Richard practically rushed back into his house. "I'll grab the footage." Inspector Lewis simply nodded. "Take your time." While Richard disappeared inside, she continued measuring the sidewalk. The measuring wheel clicked steadily across the concrete. Every few feet, she stopped, took another photograph, made another note. She wasn't just looking at the vehicles, she was documenting everything. A few minutes later, Richard returned carrying a tablet. His face was full of confidence. "I've got weeks of recordings," he proudly announced. "This woman has been harassing me every evening." Inspector Lewis accepted the tablet. "Let's have a look." Richard pressed play. The video showed exactly what I'd expected. My husband and I walking down the sidewalk, stopping beside the mailbox, me lowering the red flag, then continuing our walk. Richard folded his arms. "There. That's harassment." Inspector Lewis didn't respond. Instead, she quietly restarted the video. This time, she watched from the beginning. Not the mailbox, the driveway. 4 vehicles, blocking the sidewalk. She paused the recording, looked at Richard. "Is this how your vehicles are normally parked?" Richard answered confidently. "Every evening. It's my driveway." She nodded once, then resumed the video. The second recording looked almost identical. Different day, same vehicles, same sidewalk, same obstruction. Again, she paused. Again. She wrote something on her clipboard. Richard was beginning to look confused. "I thought you were investigating her." Inspector Lewis looked up. "I am reviewing everything you've provided." Then she continued watching. 3rd video, 4th video, 5th video. Every single recording captured exactly what Richard wanted, me lowering the mailbox flag. But they also captured something else, something he had completely overlooked. Every recording showed pedestrians leaving the sidewalk and stepping directly into the street. Parents with strollers, children on scooters, dog walkers, an elderly couple, one man using a walker, everyone forced into traffic. Richard had recorded it all himself. Inspector Lewis handed the tablet back. "Thank you." "This footage is actually very helpful." Richard smiled. "I knew it would be." "I'd like copies of every recording." "Absolutely." "I've got almost 3 weeks." "Perfect." Richard looked pleased with himself. He didn't notice the wording. She never once said. The footage would be used against me. As one of the city employees copied the files, another inspector arrived in a second vehicle. This time, he wasn't carrying a clipboard. He carried rolled-up site plans. He introduced himself. "Building compliance." Richard frowned. "Why do we need building compliance?" The inspector glanced toward the driveway. We're conducting a complete review while we're here. Richard laughed. You people are taking this way too seriously. Nobody laughed with him. The second inspector slowly walked around the front of the property. He measured the driveway, photographed the concrete, compared something against the plans, then measured again. He crouched beside the sidewalk, studied the expansion joints, walked back to the truck, returned with another document. For nearly 20 minutes, he barely said a word. Richard's confidence slowly began to fade. Finally, he couldn't stay quiet any longer. What's the problem? The inspector looked up. When was this driveway widened? Richard shrugged. I don't know. Years ago. Do you have the permit? Richard hesitated. It was already like this when we bought the house. The inspector nodded. I'll need to verify that. Then something unexpected happened. The inspector walked to the mailbox, measured its distance from the curb, measured again from the sidewalk, made another note. Richard stared in disbelief. The mailbox? The inspector replied calmly. We inspect everything within the public right-of-way. Richard looked from the mailbox to the driveway, then back toward the inspectors. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely nervous. Meanwhile, I stood quietly across the street with my husband. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. Richard had spent weeks trying to prove I was the problem. Instead, he had invited the city to examine every inch of his own property. And they were only getting started. For the next week, Richard barely left his house, which by itself was unusual. This was the same man who used to stand in his driveway every evening with his arms crossed, watching everyone walk around his vehicles as though he'd won some invisible competition. Now, the driveway sat empty. Every single vehicle had been pulled completely behind the sidewalk. For the first time in years, parents pushed strollers straight through without stopping. Children rode their scooters without swerving into traffic. Even the elderly man with the walker smiled as he passed one afternoon. My husband looked at me and quietly said, I forgot the sidewalk was actually this wide. So had I. A few days later, George knocked on my front door, carrying his morning coffee. You've got to see this. He pointed across the street. A bright orange notice had been taped to Richard's front door. Even from across the road, the words were impossible to miss. Notice of correction required. George grinned. I think the city's finished being patient. That afternoon, contractors arrived. Not one truck, 3. The first crew started removing sections of concrete from the driveway. Jackhammers echoed through the neighbourhood for hours. The second crew carefully dug around the mailbox. The third removed decorative landscaping that extended into the public right-of-way. Richard stood nearby the entire time. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply watched. Probably because by then, he'd already learned arguing with inspectors accomplished absolutely nothing. Over the next several days, the neighbourhood slowly learned what the inspectors had found. The widened driveway had never been properly permitted. Its dimensions extended beyond what had originally been approved. The mailbox had been installed inside the city's required clearance zone years earlier. Several landscaping features also encroached into the public right-of-way. Individually, none of those issues would have attracted much attention. Together, they became expensive. Very expensive. About 2 weeks later, Richard finally came outside while my husband and I were walking. For a moment, I thought he wanted another argument. Instead, he simply stood beside the newly repaired driveway, looking tired, looking older. He watched us approach. This time, there were no vehicles blocking the sidewalk. Not one. As we walked past, he quietly said, They really made me tear everything out. I looked at the fresh concrete. It looks nice. He let out a dry laugh. It cost me nearly $18,000. Neither my husband nor I replied. There wasn't really anything to say. The city hadn't punished him because I lowered a mailbox flag. The city punished him because his own property failed inspection. A few days after that, Inspector Karen Lewis stopped by while conducting a follow-up inspection. Everything had been corrected. The sidewalk was completely clear, the mailbox had been relocated, the driveway had been rebuilt. She smiled as she signed the final paperwork. That's much better. Before leaving, she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. You know, we almost closed the original complaint. I frowned. What changed? She smiled. Those videos. The ones your neighbour proudly gave us. If he'd simply moved his vehicles, we probably would have never looked any further. I couldn't help smiling. So, he investigated himself? She laughed. In a way. Yes. Then she got into her truck and drove away. That evening, my husband and I took our usual walk. For the first time in what felt like forever, we never once stepped into the street. We stayed on the sidewalk, from beginning to end. As we passed Richard's house, I glanced toward the mailbox. The little red flag was standing upright. For just a second, I smiled to myself. Then, I kept walking. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to anymore. Richard had finally learned the lesson, and the mailbox had already done its job. It's been almost 2 years since Richard's driveway was rebuilt. My husband and I still take our evening walks. Same neighbourhood, same route, same sidewalk. Only now, nobody has to step into the street anymore. Parents push strollers straight through without slowing down. Children race each other on scooters. Dog walkers chat as they pass. The elderly man with the walker still takes his evening stroll. Only now, he doesn't have to turn around halfway home. Every time I see that, I smile, because that's all we ever wanted. A sidewalk that people could actually use. Richard still lives there, surprisingly, but he's different now, much quieter. His vehicles are always parked completely behind the sidewalk, sometimes almost obsessively. I've even watched him get back into his truck just to move it another few inches after realising one tyre was too close to the concrete. The irony isn't lost on anyone. The same man who once laughed and said, "They've got a street," now measures every parking job as though an inspector might appear at any moment. Maybe that's what consequences look like. Not anger, not humiliation, just a permanent change in behaviour. A few months after everything ended, the neighbourhood held another community barbecue. The same park, the same picnic tables, the same families. Only one thing felt different. People were actually talking to each other again. George walked over, carrying a paper plate piled with barbecue. "You know," he said, "I don't think this was ever really about the mailbox." I laughed. It definitely wasn't. Helen joined us. It wasn't even about the sidewalk. "What do you mean?" She smiled. It was about respect. No one expects perfect neighbours, but everyone expects basic consideration. She was right. The blocked sidewalk had simply become the symbol of something much bigger. Richard never believed other people mattered. That was the real problem. Not long afterward, I happened to run into Inspector Karen Lewis while volunteering at a local charity event. She recognised me immediately. "Mrs. Harper, it's good to see you." We talked for a few minutes. Then I asked her something I'd been wondering ever since the inspection. "Can I ask you a question?" "Of course." "If I had never lowered that mailbox flag, would any of this have happened?" She thought about it for a moment, then smiled. "Honestly? Probably not. The complaints were there, but complaints don't always tell the whole story." She paused. "Evidence does." Then she added something I'll never forget. "Your neighbour believed the cameras would prove someone else was the problem. In reality, they simply documented his own behaviour better than anyone else could have." People sometimes ask whether I regret lowering that mailbox flag. The answer surprises them. No. Not because it annoyed Richard, and certainly not because it delayed his mail. The truth is, the mailbox never mattered. It was simply the first tiny act that exposed a much larger attitude. Richard believed public space belonged to him. He believed everyone else should adjust their lives around his convenience. When someone finally pushed back, even in the smallest possible way, his pride wouldn't let him ignore it. Instead, he escalated. He installed cameras, he posted videos online, he argued with neighbours, he invited inspectors onto his property. Step by step, he built the case against himself. Nobody tricked him, nobody framed him, nobody needed revenge. Richard made every decision himself. Looking back, the funniest part isn't that I lowered a mailbox flag hundreds of times. It's that Richard spent thousands of dollars trying to prove I was the neighbourhood troublemaker, only to hand the city weeks of perfectly organised evidence showing his own violations. He wanted the cameras. He uploaded the videos. He called attention to himself. All I ever did was take an evening walk with my husband and gently lower one little red flag. People often think karma arrives like lightning, fast, loud, spectacular. Sometimes it does, but more often, karma is much quieter. It arrives disguised as pride, as stubbornness, as the belief that rules don't apply to you. Richard thought he owned the sidewalk. In reality, he never even understood what he was standing on. Because the moment you start treating a public space as though it belongs only to you, you've already lost something far more valuable than a driveway. You've lost the respect of everyone around you. And once that's gone, no amount of concrete can rebuild it.